Thank you everyone for joining us for this talk. I love the previous two talks, and I particularly think this paper is going to be dealing with some very similar questions to the first talk, but from a very different direction. So I'm really excited to see how they speak to each other and what you guys think. So basically, this talk is going to think about government allocations in a really similar way, where we're saying that governments often target welfare towards particular groups of people, but the reasons they do so are often hard to weigh against each other. Governments target welfare towards the poor, both because they believe that the poor may be more deserving of help, but also because a dollar will probably go further towards helping a poor person than it will towards helping the wealthy. The marginal utility of a dollar will be higher if you target your welfare towards the poor. But whether or not you're using one metric or another has pretty strong implications for how you want to design your welfare programs. If you're really targeting the maximum bang per buck, that might imply a different program design than if you're just trying to maximize the welfare weights of a particular group of people. And so what we're going to think about in this project is basically we're going to kind of start from an alternative perspective here, where we're basically going to perform sort of a revealed preference analysis of how programs are designed and try to infer the implicit weightings over these two different ways of prioritizing folks. So we're going to say, kind of invert the problem, and instead of saying not necessarily along with how should policymakers make these trade-offs, let's look at the programs that do exist and let's try and infer how are they making these trade-offs. And then we can see if they actually align with what we think our values should be. So the basic intuition of this is in a given allocation for a welfare program that's primarily targeted at the poor, this could be coming from the government caring more about helping the poor, and the program just helps everybody the same. It could also be that the government has no special desire to help the poor in particular, but the poor just benefit more, and so they receive more of the welfare program. It could even be that the government loves the rich much more than the poor, but the benefits are so lopsided that we end up with a net benefit going more towards the poor. And basically, the intuition that we're going to be using in our estimation procedure is we're going to say that in a lot of programs we have information on this left-hand side and on this right-hand side, where we know we can estimate the marginal effects of a program, and we can see how the program is being allocated, and we can use that information to deduce the middle column. And then once we have all of that information, we can use this to audit the program design and see if it's actually aligning with our objectives. We're going to apply this to Mexico's Progresa anti-poverty program, which is their kind of flagship redistribution program. And we're going to take benefits of who benefits the most, or estimates of who benefits the most, basically estimates of the heterogeneous treatment effects over different groups of people. We're going to look at how the program is allocated, and then we're going to infer both the policymakers' welfare weights over households and what types of outcomes are being prioritized in terms of which heterogeneous impacts are being prioritized in the program design. And then from that, we're actually then going to be able to kind of reframe the discussion about how we want to design this program to sort of use this framework to imagine counterfactuals where the program is designed in a different way, and then estimate how that might change the implicit valuations from the program design to better align policy design with actual valuations as we imagine them a priori. So just to give you guys a preview of the results, for this particular program, we're going to find that the ranking can be explained to a large extent by these heterogeneous effects over households and differential welfare weights. Particularly important is going to be a household's indigenous status and their income, which I think makes a lot of sense from what people expect. We have pretty imprecise estimates on the actual valuations over outcomes, but they are consistent with kind of literature estimates of how much certain health and schooling outcomes should be worth. And we're going to find that counterfactuals would have had marginal impacts on balance, but that it wouldn't have completely changed the program's effects. This relates to a lot of the literature already actually spread out on the first presentation, but in particular, we're going to be thinking about the targeting and taxation literature, also the Progresa literature as well. And we're also going to relate this literature to a broader kind of machine learning literature that's come up recently around fairness, welfare, and part of the impetus for starting this project is the innovations in estimating heterogeneous treatment effects that kind of allow us to identify these different dimensions of prioritization to a degree that hasn't been possible before. So first, I'm going to sketch out like a very basic social welfare model. And that's going to motivate sort of like how we're going to break apart priorities over different outcomes and priorities over different types of individuals. So I think this will look familiar to a lot of you guys. It's basically a social planner problem where we're going to be summing utilities over individuals. Individuals will be weighted according to a welfare weight, which in our context is mu, but in the last presentation would correspond to their lambda. And here we're going to have our mu be a function of characteristics. So your welfare weight is going to be based on your observables. So abstracting away from a lot of the really fun nuance of that earlier talk. And then we're going to say that your utility is a function of like a weighted sum over outcomes. So kind of weighted sum over how healthy your household is, how whether your kids are going to school, how much consumption you enjoy. And then the benefit in terms of the social planner's perspective from providing a welfare program to a household is going to be basically the differential impact of the program on these outcomes multiplied by the welfare weight on that household. The policymaker is going to rank the households according to priority ranking, which is going to be a very convenient Gumbel error term to allow us to estimate this with ordinal logit in a framework that I think will be familiar to a lot of folks here. So basically this is a two-step procedure where we're going to start by estimating the heterogeneous treatment effects of a program. And then we're going to use these estimates of the heterogeneous impacts to infer the mu and the lambdas over, which are the welfare weights over households and the impact weights over outcomes. And then with these together, we'll have like the whole proposed system of how programs are implicitly valuing different types of households and different types of outcomes. The identification here is basically coming from both the differences in the ranking and the differences in the program impacts. So we're able to identify these two dimensions of priority because we now have two dimensions of variation over the households where the policymakers are prioritizing some households over others. And also the program is impacting some households more than others. And these two together will allow us to identify the full system of equations. So Progressa is a very well-studied program, in large part because Mexico implemented it via an RCT. They had a staggered rollout over impoverished villages in Mexico. And so they have really well-identified treatment effects. And they also targeted households using a household poverty index, which is going to be our metric here of government priorities over households. So we're going to follow that same two-step procedure that I just laid out, where we're going to first estimate heterogeneous effects over households using causal forests. That's going to allow us to get really precise heterogeneity over different outcomes. And then we're going to characterize the revealed preferences implicit in the government design using these measures of welfare weights and the impact weights. Then we're going to lay out how once we have this full system, we can basically project what would have happened if the government had designed the program differently and try to reframe the discussion about how this program should have been targeted. So to start with, just to kind of give us a baseline of comparison, we're just going to run an ordinal logit of the priority ranking over observable household characteristics. This doesn't try to separate how different households were affected differentially by the program. This is just going to look at which households were actually given the welfare program. And we're going to find that the program is being allocated to indigenous households, to poorer households, and then especially to households with lots of kids. And then we're going to add our methods. So first, we're going to estimate these heterogeneous treatment effects. We find a lot of heterogeneity. We find on average that increases consumption, that it reduces sickness and reduces missed school days. The two of the outcomes here are measured as bads, so negative average impacts are a good thing. That's the program working. We find that household income, household size are very determinative of these different heterogeneous impacts. And then we're going to add it to our framework. And basically what we're going to find here is that Indigenous households, their welfare weight goes up when we take into account the fact that they're being prioritized in the ranking despite not having as strong treatment effects from the program. So in order to basically account for their positive variation in the scoring function, it must be that their welfare weights are higher than it would seem naively. And we're going to basically be able to say that the relative priority is going to be stronger for Indigenous and poorer households in these contexts. And we're going to get really noisy estimates for the implied valuation over impacts. Those standard errors in parentheses are really, really big. And we're actually seeing, the biggest thing we're seeing here really is that heterogeneity in impacts over sickness and missed schooling does not seem to have very much explanatory power over placement in this priority ranking. We're seeing that a lot of the sort of like weight on the program is going through sort of is not being channeled through the relative impacts over the causal effects. And so the first thing that we're going to try and do with this framework then is basically try to evaluate what happened when the government changes their ranking system. So something that's really nice about Progressa is they actually updated how they were targeting households in 2003. And so we can run this procedure for the first priority ranking and then the second priority ranking. And in this kind of stable framework, evaluate how this change in targeting adjusted the implicit prioritization across different groups. And so we're going to find that in 2003, the government implicitly started prioritizing Indigenous households more, but started putting much less weight on poorer households or on households' income. We're going to find that there's moderately more weight on the like actual outcomes of households, but again, the variance of those estimates is too large to make any strong claims. Then what we're going to do, as I described before, is we can actually use this framework to basically frame a discussion about alternate allocation rules. So how could we have designed this program if we feel that we disagree with some of these impact weights? How could we redesign the program to target different households differently? And what would have been the results? Because we actually have estimates of the heterogeneous impact weights, we have enough information to not just project out who would have gotten the program, but what would have been the average outcome levels. So we can see that a allocation here, an allocation that had basically no welfare weights over different households would have effectively, we can see kind of like on the bottom row, the average consumption levels could have been targeted to increase the basically average impact of the program overall if you were not caring at all about welfare weights over different types of households. But then once you reintroduce the fact that the program is actually targeting especially like poorer households, then we see that the average consumption levels would actually have to be traded off against a higher welfare weight on targeted households that may not be the ones for which you see the largest relative impact. We can then say that because our impact weights, for example, are estimated with a lot of noise, we can just impose impact weights inferred from the literature and say that these are the levels of prioritization that we want to put on certain types of outcomes. And then we can project what the types of program design would have been if those were sort of within our framework. And then finally, we can imagine ourselves as only caring about one outcome or another and basically put ourselves in the position of a policymaker who basically just wants to maximize given welfare weights over particular types of outcomes. And then we're also, I'm just going to skip this part, we're also running a survey of households in Mexico to try and get at welfare weights in another direction and see how well our inferred welfare weights correspond to those that people reveal through surveys as sort of what types of families they would like to be targeted by welfare. So basically, we're trying to introduce here a tool that would allow policymaking to kind of rather than sort of have this two-step process of you design a policy and then you implement it, kind of have a cycle where you design it, you implement it, you see who's being impacted, you see who's being implicitly prioritized, and then you redesign. And sort of it allows a mechanism of auditing existing policy design and then realigning these policies with the stated objectives. Great, and thanks everyone for listening. That's our presentation.